So Elad and I are technology investors. We've been doing this for a long time. And if we look at the last 18 months or so, a lot of our time has been going into cryptocurrencies. And there's a very simple reason for that. A lot of the people we respect in the Valley that are doing great technology work are all pivoting into this area. And I think when you step back from a lot of the market creation around crypto and you say, well, why is this really happening? This premise of decentralization is quite interesting, right? Great platforms have been built over the last decade. It's sort of spawned off a new set of innovation, a lot of full stack companies getting created, but they're all being run by large tech companies that frankly make very pivotal decisions. And so this whole idea of decentralizing and creating a more consensus-driven innovation makes a lot of sense. And that's inspiring a lot of people. I mean, one of the reasons, everywhere there's a blockchain conference these days, there's a large set of audiences is because everybody's trying to learn. And so I thought we would talk today about, well, what's really required to actually truly make this space successful. Leave aside short-term value creation, leave aside speculation and the crypto rush. We got to start using crypto rush versus the gold rush now. As to why this is important in the long run, why this is the applications and the protocols around blockchain are interesting. And the biggest issue that I see from true decentralization to happen, where everybody can benefit from this, because if you actually look at who's holding a bunch of the currencies, there's very few people. It's a few people that have been pivotal in making this space happen, and then there's a bunch of Silicon Valley types. So you're actually arguably seeing concentration of value yet again. And we don't think it's going to change, and we don't think in the long run this ends up being truly successful until you see decentralization happening, which requires banks to get in. So we thought we would spend a few minutes today talking through what are the key challenges that need to be overcome to truly make this happen successfully. So maybe, Elad, do you want to just talk for a few minutes about just challenges that you see are just getting in the way?
Yeah, totally.
We'll take it from
Did
there.
people see the news on NEM today? What happened in the Japanese exchange? $400 million in NEM was transferred with sort of uncertain purview in terms of who was actually going to. And so if you look at the actual infrastructure that exists today for people to custody crypto and to participate in it, be it ETFs, index funds, et cetera, a lot of the basic infrastructure is still really lacking. And you see the news recently with BitGo actually acquiring Kingdom Trust, so they're really trying to build a custodium. There's companies that have been funded recently by Andreessen and others to hit different parts of this space. And so it looks like it's a market that's really undergoing a big transformation from the perspective of the fundamental pieces of infrastructure that are missing. And I would sort of summarize those as sort of three layers. Number one is integrations into primary distribution nodes. So that would be Fidelity's work with Coinbase. That would be things like Bitwise, which is a index fund that I think both General Catalyst and I have funded. That would be things like custody solutions. And so there's this whole financial services stack that currently is actually quite broken and leads to things like a $400 million theft because you haven't necessarily been able to time lock things from a custody perspective. You haven't been able to, somebody was talking earlier about white labeling the addresses that you could actually transfer things out to. Like a lot of that infrastructure is actually missing at scale. And traditionally, the people who provided that have been the large banking partners. So for example, State Street drives one of the major custodial services for sort of the rest of the world, but they're not really in the cryptocurrency market. So there's a really big market gap right now in terms of traditional participants versus sort of new people building products coming in. And I think we'll see a lot of consolidation in that as some of the bigger banks wake up and start buying some of these solutions for their own client base.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that's important, again, is to make it more accessible to broader markets. So what do you think are the kinds of companies that need to exist? You've obviously got these wallet companies, you've got exchanges popping up, but just to make it fundamentally easier for consumers, and frankly, creating what would be an open internet for money, just like we've had the open internet for bits. I mean, that's really what we're going towards, and it's all these walled gardens today that you can try to participate in. But like, how does this become much more interoperable from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I think two things. Number one is at a meta level. If you look at the history of sort of asset growth and bubbles and speculation and everything else, typically you have an institutional set of investors who then offload onto retail, and you typically know the music is about to stop when that happens. In the case of crypto, we actually had a very small retail community, the early crypto enthusiasts, who are now offloading into new institutions that are coming online. All the hedge funds and everybody else are starting to buy crypto. And then eventually that's going to get offloaded on mainstream retail, and I think that's actually when you can call the peak of the bubble, and things will crash and then come back, in terms of long-term value. In terms of sort of infrastructure that will enable that, I actually think there's a few examples on the financial services side that we talked about in terms of custody and ease of access to wallets and exchanges and things like that. I actually think there's also the embrace by the traditional tech community that should happen. So for example, if Apple actually distributed a wallet on top of every Apple device, if you actually think of what they have from a hardware perspective, they actually have the same hardware components in terms of secure key management and everything else that Ledger has. And it has biometrics, and it has a lot of the sort of core things that you'd want in a hardware wallet. And so you could imagine, for example, Apple distributing a wallet. It could be Coinbase. It could be something they build, integrated with Apple Pay or other payments mechanisms. So you have both the store of value side of it, the ability to trade on top of it, and then you have the ability to actually use that for transactions. That, to me, is a really exciting example of an integration with a large player that would cause instant distribution to 1 billion devices, right? And I think a lot of folks in the crypto community are starting to think more and more about how do you integrate with either traditional banking services or traditional tech companies. Another example would be integration with browser more deeply, Chrome or Safari or something else. Again, there's Ethereum browsers and other things being built, but if you just had it built into a native browser and then it becomes either a payment or other interaction mechanism, I think that's really powerful. So I think that sort of adoption still needs to happen.
Yeah. So retail banks, bit of an enigma to me. I think we have too many banks in the U.S. There's an imminent consolidation. It's a wave that started a few years ago. So if you're smaller banks, you would say, as management teams of these banks, you would want to take some risk and try to innovate and avoid relevancy. A lot of these banks today have we're building our own blockchain, but as you and I know, these are not technology entities, and they're not going to be able to succeed in building the right protocols. So why aren't they doing this? Like, what's the key risk and that they're sort of shying away from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of the people at the top banks, and I've talked to board members at some of the biggest sort of retail outlets for sort of mass scale participation in banking services, and a lot of them are very skeptical in terms of whether cryptocurrencies are actually real stores of value. So they really question Bitcoin or other things acting as a store of value. And the fundamental argument is always like, well, I can look at anything else and it represents a cash flow or it represents something else, and so therefore it's a real asset, and this thing is theoretical. And you start getting into big arguments with them about reflexive assets and why is an art piece worth $100 million? Or why is gold worth 7 trillion? These things are sort of similar in nature. So I think one is just skepticism at the top, and I think Jamie Dimon or Dimon, I never know how to pronounce his name, was a good example of. It shows you how far apart these communities are. I don't even know how to say his name. But he, that's a great example of somebody at the top basically saying, I don't believe in this trend, and therefore it's preventing a lot of innovation. What's happened is for the last couple of years, the banks, the large banks, and we'll get to small banks in a minute, the large banks have basically said, we don't believe in cryptocurrencies, but we believe in blockchain, which is sort of like saying, I believe in TCP/IP, but I don't believe in the internet, or whatever equivalent you want to make. And right. So what they've been doing is they establish these internal blockchain groups, and these groups are basically research groups that don't really do anything. Yep. And then during a board meeting, when the board member asks them, what are you doing in crypto? They say, oh, we have a blockchain group, so we're on it. And then nothing happens. And so that was sort of up until 2017. That was like 2013 from the first sort of spike and crash that we saw until 2017 was the behavior of the banks, except for actually Fidelity, who was mining, and they're not really a bank, but they're actually mining Bitcoin and stuff. And so I do think that's now shifting in late 2017, early 2018, where I feel like there was a real tipping point moment where a lot of the big institutions are starting to wake up and say, our institutional clients are asking for this, and therefore we should start building solutions for it. And then that's going to bleed over into retail.
One of the things that will make a big difference in accelerating them to move in here is obviously you can frame it either way, but the impending showdown with the SEC and regulations in general, right?
Yeah.
The SEC just put out an op-ed, as we were talking about it earlier. What's your view? Do you think this is a massive issue and the industry is going to take a step back before it sort of reorganizes itself and adjusts to it? Or how do you see the next 12, 18 months playing out?
Yeah. So how many people here think that major governments are going to try and shut down cryptocurrencies at scale over the next couple of years? They've tried in some markets, China and more recently Korea and things like that. I'm thinking like US or certain Western markets. Or,
They got the guidelines, so I think more so they'll come up with their own cryptocurrency.
yeah.
So this might be a biased group to answer that. But.
The reason I ask is, in the cryptocurrency community, I think everybody is expecting a giant showdown. Like people are saying eventually the US government's going to shut everything down and all these other governments are going to shut everything down. If you ask in reality what governments want and what they're worried about is sort of three things. Number one, they don't want people to speculate wildly on assets, and they don't want tons of people to lose money who are vulnerable, who don't quite understand what's going on. And so that's a lot of the SEC letter and other things around ICOs. And honestly, there's been bad actors there, and there have been very good actors there, right? The second thing is they want you to pay taxes. Taxes are the fundamental thing that drives governments and actually drives our society, right? It pays for schools, and it pays for a subset of healthcare, and it pays for other things, and it obviously pays for a lot of wasteful stuff too. But fundamentally, they want to be able to tax people. And then lastly, they really want to be able to control certain aspects of monetary policy in the country. And so really, those are the three things that I think that drive government action. And if you look at those sequentially, the first one, I think, the SEC or other regulators have been issuing guidance ongoing for some of these things. And I do think they'll, like they have in the past, choose some bad actors and point them out. And we may see broader action. But I'm actually not really worried about the SEC doing a giant crackdown that will shut down the entire space. It just doesn't make sense to me. The second thing is the taxation side, and the real question is, my understanding is that last year it was like, I think it was 800 people paid taxes on crypto, is that right? It was a very small number.
How many people here paid taxes?
It was a surprisingly small number, and I think I knew like 50 of them, do you know what I mean? And so, and so and it could just be everybody's like, holding, or it could be other things, but fundamentally, I think that actually to me is the biggest short-term issue is are they able to collect taxes at scale on an asset class that's growing? And there's all sorts of ways they can do that by actually controlling the fiat to crypto on-ramps, right? So they can basically go, and this already happened with Coinbase where a subset of the records were publicly requested. You can start actually auditing these things and then following up on that. And then lastly is sort of the monetary policy side. And I do think that there's a short window where they can really control that, and then it's sort of like the gas is escaping from the chamber and enough gas gets out is kind of game over. And I think if the governments wait too long, then you can't shut down you'll effectively have to shut down the internet to shut down cryptocurrencies. So
there is a little bit of concern around, hey, if these currencies are truly global, it sort of impacts your sovereignty. And like, how do you see that playing out? If you look at mining in different parts of the world, there is sort of currencies emerging that are more tied to geographies. Do you see that trend playing out, or?
No, I think that's a trend that will stop because ultimately it's a market. I mean, we'll continue because it's a market-driven dynamic.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think there are going to be things that really will be cross-platform, and in my mind, it's very similar to.
So will it be like the internet platforms? There's one of everything in the rest of the world in China, and it'll be the same thing that happens here?
Up to a point. I mean, in China in particular, there was a lot of restrictions on foreign services entering the market.
Right.
And so the question is the degree to which that can be reinforced on the crypto side. But I mean, you do see very clear behavior. Like, my sense is Tron, which is great name, terrible token in terms of nothing really there yet. Tron is a good example of something where my sense is it's really being driven by Japan. My sense is the uptick in Ripple was largely driven by Korean markets. Something like 30% of Korean households now own some cryptocurrencies. So I do think we see these really interesting regional behaviors driving both global pricing as well as global adoption of different tokens. And I think that will continue for some period of time, especially as things are concentrated. As things start to fragment and more households start to own it and more people participate, then you may imagine something smoothing out, but you should still imagine some regional trends or spikes.
Yeah. So look, we're coming to the end of our chat, Fireless chat. The only thing I would love to leave you guys with is, I think as we discussed, for this to truly become mainstream, these services need the banking infrastructure to make it accessible to everybody else. So those of you that are in and around this, the banking industry, I think start to think about how you can innovate, co-opt and partner with the technology industry, because this is where a lot of the entrepreneurs are working on thinking through solving a great set of a lot of the problems that we were just talking about. And you know, the more we can progress in that regard, hopefully you're right about regulation, and it's actually not as big an issue and imminently solvable when you actually decompose it into the framework you laid out. So, hopefully 2018 will be an exciting year for all of us. Thank you.
Right, thank you.